name is Tom Hodge. Thank you for being here. I'm the chair of the Russian department. And it's an honor and both a personal and professional pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Before I get to that, I just want to say a huge thank you to the people who made this possible today. First and foremost, the person who just closed that door, Katie Sango Jackson. Can we please give her a big hand for all the work she did? Thank you. Nothing happens in Russian and Russian area studies without Katie sort of making it happen. So Katie, we're very grateful, and thanks to the student administrative assistants as well. So Dr. Julie A. Cassidy is the Wilcox B. and Harriet M. Adsit Professor of Russian at Williams College. She received her bachelor's degree from another small liberal arts college, Grinnell College in Iowa, and her MA and PhD from Stanford University. She has had a truly exceptional career as a teacher, a scholar, and a leader in our field, serving, for example, several years ago as president of the Association for Slavic East European and Eurasian Studies, fondly known as ASEAS, our largest professional organization. So that is a big deal to run that ship. On a personal note, one of my proudest accomplishments in this field is that I gave Julie her tour of Stanford University when she was choosing among graduate programs way back in, dare I say, the year 1987. And the good news is she came after the tour, which was great. Okay, so a distinguished scholar of performance in multiple senses of that word, in Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. Julie is the author of close to 20 articles, over 30 substantial book reviews, and the co-editor of a book called Russian Performances, Word, Object, Action with University of Wisconsin Press in 2018, which won her the 2020 Book Prize for Best Edited Multi-Author Scholarly Volume from the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages, fondly known as ATSEAL, which is our second biggest professional organization. That too is a big deal. Julie is also, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes tonight, the author of, or the solo author of two books. The first is The Enemy on Trial, Early Soviet Courts on Stage and Screen, with Northern University, Illinois Press, which came out in 2000, and then which appeared 2 decades later, just a couple years ago, in an authorized Russian translation with the distinguished series of Western Russian studies under the Academic Studies Press Imprimatur. Her second book is Russian Style, and I have it right here, Russian Style, Performing Gender, Power, and Putinism, University of Wisconsin Press, which just came out last year and was shortlisted this year for the Pushkin House Book Prize, another big deal. Allow me to quote from the rave review that appeared this February in the Times Literary Supplement. I quote, "What Cassidy proposes is nothing less than a new political and cultural theory that shows how a militaristic ideology is created through a participatory internet culture, winking irony, and an emphasis on entertainment and performance. For these reasons, Russian Style is an important book, but it's also a lot of fun," unquote. Important and a lot of fun. Those words describe perfectly the author of the book as well. Her lecture tonight, this afternoon, is entitled Russian Style, or What Twerking Air Cadets and Gay Propaganda Tell Us About Putin's War in Ukraine. Please join me in welcoming Professor Julie Cassidy. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking Tom for that really generous introduction, and also thanking the people who brought me here, Tom and Katie, and thanking all of you for coming and listening to me talk about some sections from my book. I spent a lot of time, about 10 years working on this, and it's always exciting to have people who want to know what I wrote about. So I hope I will keep it fun, and I hope that you will think of all kinds of questions to ask me when I get to the end. Okay, so to start my talk today, I'd like to show you a short video that hit the internet in January of 2018.
then just touch me till I can get my satisfaction. 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 Satisfaction.
Push me, and then just touch me, till I can get my satisfaction. 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 Satisfaction.
Push me, and then just touch me till I can get my satisfaction.
Push me, and then just touch me, till I can get my satisfaction.
Okay, hope you enjoyed that. The video you just saw was made by students at an Institute of Aeronautical Engineering in the Russian city of Ulyanovsk. The air cadets filmed themselves in the halls of their dorm as they created their own version of a music video from 2002 called Satisfaction by Italian DJ Benny Benassi. Benassi's original video shows scantily clad women in safety glasses using a series of tools from simple saw to industrial jackhammer, and a campy send-up of the marketing that uses women's bodies to sell everything from cars to power drills. However, the Ulyanovsk cadets took their direct inspiration from a 2013 parody made by soldiers in the British Army, which transformed Benassi's bikini-clad women wielding belt sanders into Tom of Finland wannabes pushing brooms, vacuums, and irons. The Russian video follows its British predecessor closely. The cadets wear improvised costumes that combine their own underwear and belts with ties and caps from their military uniforms, and they deliver a series of gyrating pelvic thrusts as they sweep, hammer, and iron and dust their way through their dorm. Using gestures that by 2018 were already cliches of gay male sexuality, like filleting a half-peeled banana, the Ulyanovsk cadets never imagined that their parody of a parody of a parody would go viral and lead to accusations of gay propaganda, something that the Russian Federation first outlawed in 2013. The Ulyanovsk cadets' 2-minute video placed them in the crosshairs of public scrutiny as Russian officials debated the young men's supposed transgression and whether it merited punishment. Some called the video a tragedy, while others viewed it as an insult to the entire Ulyanovsk region as well as Russian veterans, calling it a scandal for aviation and comparing the cadets to the feminist punk protesters of Pussy Riot. At the same time, a spate of new Satisfaction parodies began to appear on YouTube in support of the cadets, making what started as a single video into a viral movement that embraced Russians from all walks of life: students, swimmers, jockeys, dancers, and even 2 retired women in the kitchen of their communal apartment. By the time the scandal died down, the flood of Satisfaction parodies clearly showed that these young men and their supporters were willing and perhaps even eager to create potential gay propaganda, whether they were gay or not. When viewed from our perspective here in the US, the Satisfaction videos looked like another episode in Russia's ongoing culture wars, to which we in the West could turn for a good laugh while bemoaning the growing illiberality of Vladimir Putin's Russia. The videos of Russians twerking to Italian technopop seemed home right alongside photographs of a topless Putin from the 2000s. Coverage of the Pussy Riot affair in 2012, or news stories coming out of Russia about a 2014 embargo on women's lace panties for supposed safety reasons, go figure, or a 2017 judicial ruling that outlawed a meme of Putin as a gay clown. When taken together, these stories reinforce long-standing stereotypes about Russia, where men are apparently more manly and women more feminine than in the West. The first 2 decades of Putin's rule may have led to a conservative backlash on the one hand, yet it also saw an upturn in Russians' willingness to adopt exaggerated and often ironic styles of gender and sexuality on the other. While many in the West took pride in increasingly liberal policies like the legalization of same-sex marriage and the Me Too movement, the Russian East seemed to have fallen victim to a rising tide of neo-national, neo-traditionalism, whose alternating cycles of seriousness and irony were tough to read. Although such stereotypes contrasting East and West contain a grain of truth, they fail to explain why gender and sexuality were so hotly contested in post-Soviet Russia, as well as how they became Putin's go-to weapons in the domestic arena between 2000 and 2020. Because these stereotypes define Russia in relation to the West, they fail to recognize that 2 intertwined threads give narrative coherence to news stories about young Russian women ripping their shirts open for Putin, or government officials suggesting that gays be banned from blood donations. Those threads were Russians' own performance of increasingly polarized gender roles and the Putin regime's growing desire to police private sexual behavior in the 2000s and the 2010s. Social scientists have examined these trends in their analysis of Putin's time in office. For example, anthropologists and sociologists have documented the emergence of gendered neo-traditionalism in statements from Putin's government and the Russian Orthodox Church, while economists and political scientists debate the extent to which Russia adopted neoliberalism with its emphasis on entrepreneurial individualism and self-regulation after the Soviet Union's demise. This has led some to view gender and sexuality as tools of political legitimation in Putin's Russia, while others have concluded that a biopolitical turn has taken place there, as seen in the growing number of Russian laws constraining human bodies. When taken together, the insights of social scientists give us a useful lens for understanding Russian legislation and policy between 2000 and 2020 that focused on gender and sexuality. Abandoning any consistent ideology, the Putin regime made heteronormativity with its requisite homophobia into an ideological proxy, redefining Russian citizenship through the imperatives of compulsory heterosexuality and hypergender, that is, embodying essentialized, polarized, and supposedly traditional forms of masculinity and femininity. Now, unsurprisingly, the trends identified by social scientists took on a life of their own in Russian culture, which in the past 20-plus years has generated everything from enthusiastic support for the traditional values advocated by the Kremlin to angry protests against its failed promises, corruption, and fraud. At first, Putin's regime exerted only limited control over the country's popular culture, which offered a powerful means of transmitting and interpreting the model of gendered and sexualized citizenship that emerged after he first became president in 1999. The variegated universe of pop, spanning television, film, radio, music, social media, advertising, and of course viral videos, helped to shift Russian identity and citizenship away from ontological definitions based, for example, on where we or our parents are born. Instead, Russian identity and citizenship became largely matters of style and performance. That is the result of embodied practices, such as the languages we speak, the holidays we observe, the traditions we observe, what we eat and drink, the clothes we wear, as well as with whom we have sex and how. With Putin at Russia's helm, the country's ideal citizen became increasingly defined by stylistic attributes and even acquired an explicit age, gender, sexual orientation, and attitude. The paradigmatic Russian who emerged in the 2000s and 2010s was not the country's hypermasculine leader, was not an oligarch, or was not even a man, but a young, sexually available heterosexual woman who actively shaped her body, behavior, and desires in response to Vladimir Putin. Sexy Putin cheerleaders, like the journalism students from Moscow State University who posed for this pro-regime calendar, represented Russia's model citizens in the 2000s. At the same time, queer men of all types became the country's scapegoat, which brings us back to the twerking cadets from Ulyanovsk. Their campy performance of gayness was much more than a goofy parody of an Italian techno video. Whether they knew it or not, the cadets and their supporters tapped into what theorist Susan Sontag called the whole point of camp as a style: to dethrone the serious, to be serious about the frivolous, and to be frivolous about the serious. The Ulyanovsk cadets also showed that Russians can still form horizontal connections among themselves despite the Russian state's growing monopoly on the public sphere, as journalist Masha Gessen pointed out. The gayness, frivolity, and connectivity of the Satisfaction videos showed the cadets' mastery of camp as an embodied style, as well as the failure of Putin's regime to enforce the allegedly traditional forms of gender and sexuality that it claimed as the foundation of Russian citizenship and Russian civilization. Rather than play along with Putin's heteronormative mandate, the Ulyanovsk cadets revealed that it had nothing to do with natural or essential Russianness, whatever those might be. Rather, being Russian was simply a question of style. Their twerking bodies gutted Putin's repeated call for Russians to be real men and real women of all plausibility. And the Ulyanovsk cadets exposed an inherent contradiction in the heteronormative laws, the PR stunts, and the news stories I've just described. All of these claim that the gender of real Russians is strictly binary, and their sexuality entirely straight, through performances whose very nature proves the opposite. Whether we consider the 2018 law that decriminalized certain forms of domestic abuse, or this photo op of Putin flexing his biceps in the Kremlin's gym, such gestures inevitably fail to construct a naturally heteronormative Russianness, since they can never disguise the fact that they are just performances. In my talk today, I'd like to argue that the performative contradiction built into each and every one of the gestures, these gestures, resulted in Putin steadily ratcheting up his own hypermasculine style during the 2000s, which ultimately led to Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, the ensuing conflict in Donbass, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. I'm going to leave it to the social scientists to analyze the many economic and geopolitical factors that fed into the trajectory I've just described. As a humanist, I believe it's just as important for us to understand the role that cultural factors, like the ideological proxies of heteronormativity and homophobia, played in the build-up to the war in Ukraine. We can grasp the central role of Putin's heteronormative restyling of Russian culture in this process once we consider phenomena like the Ulyanovsk cadets' viral celebrity and the infamous gay propaganda law, which, although it first came into effect in 2013, was significantly strengthened less than a year after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In addition to representing a key moment in Putin's slow slide toward fascism, the gay propaganda law, or more officially, Article 6.21 of the Russian Federation's Administrative Law Code, illustrates how each and every one of the strategies intended to make Russians' gender and sexuality more traditional during the past 20 years contained the seeds of its own undoing. By making Russian citizens into creatures of style and performance, Putin's backed himself into a corner whose only escape, as he sadly seems to believe, is the war in Ukraine. Now, understanding the cultural significance of this gay propaganda law requires us to tread very, very briefly on the turf of the social scientists and to consider the demographic crisis that Putin faced when he first rose to power. The post-Soviet era witnessed a dramatic fall in life expectancy for both men and women in the Russian Federation, and the 2000s continued the trends of a high death rate, especially for Russian men, and a falling birth rate. These led to a shrinking population, which forced Putin's government to confront the failure of Russians to reproduce the nation. In addition to incentivizing motherhood through a 2007 program called Maternity Capital, Putin's regime turned to symbolic politics in hopes of boosting Russia's population and finding a scapegoat for the demographic downturn. Article 6.21 trickled up from cities in the Russian provinces, including Ryazan, Arkhangelsk, and St. Petersburg, during the early 2010s, and it finally gained approval on the federal level in 2013, making it clear that non-reproductive sexuality in the guise of Russia's so-called sexual minorities could effectively serve as the country's internal enemy. The law's initial aim of protecting minors from gay propaganda cloaks an attempt to prop up the flagging masculinity of Russian men, reinvigorate reproductive heterosexuality, and construct the country as categorically straight. Moreover, the gay propaganda law transformed homophobia, which was already a constitutive element in the performance of post-Soviet national identity, into a state-sanctioned duty. Now that Article 6.21 has been enforced for over a decade and expanded from protecting those under the age of 18 to Russians of all generations, we have a clear understanding of the very real harm it's done to the country's LGBTQ+ population. However, the actual language of the 2013 version of the law targets neither LGBTQ+ Russians nor their supposedly non-normative sex practices. Rather, the gay propaganda law attempts to eradicate discourse about LGBTQ+ identities and lifestyles. In layman's terms, Article 6.21, the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations, prohibits describing or depicting anything associated with LGBTQ+ in anything but a negative light. To quote from the law's cumbersome legalese, which you can read on that slide, it penalized those who foment non-traditional sexual arrangements, the attractiveness of non-traditional sexual relations, a perverted conception of the social equality of traditional and non-traditional sexual relations, as well as those who impose information about non-traditional sexual relations provoking interest in such relations. That is a mouthful, okay? Interestingly, the law does not address criminal liability, nor does its prosecution require that anyone be exposed to or swayed by the gay propaganda in question. In short, Article 6.21 is meant to censor all positive depictions of LGBTQ+ people, to limit Russians' freedom of expression, and to foster moral panic. Those who study the law agree that it signaled a fundamental change in discourse about homosexuality in Russia. They describe how Article 6.21 created what they call a discursive shift that refutes the essentialization of sexual identity and moves the focus from individual to collective and from identity to behavior. These scholars argue that the law created a shift from physically isolating queer bodies to discursively isolating information about queerness, which signaled a move from regulating personal behavior to governing public appearances. When taken together, these discursive shifts suggest that the law represents a watershed in post-Soviet performativity. Now, to understand this watershed, we need only consider how Article 6.21 refutes essentialized sexual identity for queers and non-queers alike. Interestingly, at no point in Russia's history has the country fully subscribed to the idea that sexual preference or orientation is inborn. The gay propaganda law continues this practice by assuming that sexual identity is subject to change and vulnerable to forces from outside the individual. The initial version of the law, for example, presumes that children are inherently heterosexual but can change their sexual orientation if they're introduced to alternative sexualities in the form of gay propaganda. In addition to articulating a surprisingly postmodern sexual fluidity, the discourse about queerness generated by the law plays free and easy with two different types of sexual subjectivity. The sexual subject is split in two. One part rests on a person's essential truth about themselves, the sexuality with which they're born. Another part of the subject is performative and can be constructed by environmental factors like gay propaganda. However, this constructivism isn't understood as something complex and intertwined. It's understood in Soviet social engineering terms. In other words, people are constructed in a short period of time by propaganda they see in newspapers, the law, and education. This amalgam, this blend of essentialist and constructionist identities reveals that the episteme of Russian sexuality is, in fact, queer, and suggests that queer theory offers a better paradigm for explaining Article 6.21's anti-subjective discourse than theories positing a coherent sexual subject. In other words, the discursive shifts ushered in by the gay propaganda law queer subjectivity itself, leading to a post-Soviet subject whose performativity focuses on behavior, appearance, style. Now, the realization that Russia's repressive gay propaganda law shares common territory with liberatory queer theory from the West is pretty surprising, to say the least. Yet if we pursue this idea, we quickly see that many of the assumptions embedded in Article 6.21 represent a dumbing down of the concept of performativity at the core of queer theory. Perhaps most obviously, the law's tedious repetition of the phrase non-traditional sexual relations reduces the nuanced understanding of identity as a performative construct first formulated by theorists like Eve Sedgwick and Judith Butler to a blunt presumption that the sex we have determines who we are. Now, this phrase, which the law itself never defines, depicts queerness not as an identity, but as a grab bag of deviant sexual practices, leaving precisely what these practices are to our imagination. Moreover, by banning discourse about sex acts that the law refuses to name, it encourages Russians of all sexual orientations to cordon off their private lives, in which they can engage in and talk about the full gamut of sex acts, from their public lives, in which their behavior and appearance have to demonstrate Russia's supposedly heterosexual, patriarchal, and reproductive sexual traditions. This public-private divide encourages all Russians, gay and straight alike, to adopt a drag version of both hypergender and heterosexuality. Fittingly, the performance of straightness fostered by Article 6.21 inverts a popular misreading of Butler's analysis of drag in her seminal book, Gender Trouble. This simplification of Butler's argument views drag queens as the paradigm of subversive action and a model for political agency, and drag as a form of gender parity that necessarily disrupts and subverts heteronormativity. Likewise, the style of cisgender drag, inspired by the gay propaganda law, inevitably buttresses norms of gender and reproductive sexuality, affirming them as instruments of cultural hegemony. In addition to the notion of performativity, Article 6.21 also vulgarizes the very concept of a performative speech act as first formulated by the philosopher J.L. Austin. The law's prohibition of gay propaganda assumes that any less than damning representation of homosexuality functions as a performative utterance, that is, as a speech act with the power to change the social reality it describes. In fact, the law seems to take for granted the smooth and happy functioning, what Austin called felicity, of gay propaganda as a performative utterance. Apparently, the Kremlin viewed the gay propaganda banned by the law as the antithesis of much of the political discourse it generated before 2020, whose infelicity was intended to discourage citizens from taking part in the political process. Putin's annual TV call-in shows to the Russian nation before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine illustrated the numbing effect of many of the country's political rituals, in which Russia's leader routinely repeated hollow performative utterances that failed to produce the changes they promised. On the contrary, the gay propaganda banned by Article 6.21 restored the magical ability of doing things to words, since the law posits that a simple slogan like "gay is okay" has the power to turn everyone who hears it into a homosexual, including those of us in the room who aren't already one. So, examining the performative assumptions embedded in the gay propaganda law ultimately leads us to the realization that Article 6.21, like all legal statutes, is itself a performative utterance that seeks to change Russian society through words. However, such censorship laws inevitably suffer from a performative contradiction, since they state what they do not want stated and introduce censored speech into public discourse, making the very public utterances they sought to preempt. Thanks to this performative contradiction, Article 6.21 did not quash all positive depictions of LGBTQ+ identities and lifestyles in Russia. On the contrary, the law propagated a great deal of discourse, good, bad, and ugly, about LGBTQ+ individuals and experiences. In addition to encouraging some very violent hate groups, the law inspired countless publications for those curious about precisely what it censors: a brief boom in Russian-language queer media around the year 2020, and a new generation of LGBTQ+ activists. In addition, the law's prosecution requires that Russian courts enlist expert testimony to determine what is and is not gay propaganda in much detail, generating more discourse about homosexuality in the Russian legal system than ever before. If Article 6.21 aims to clamp down on discourse about LGBTQ+ identities and lifestyles, it clearly enjoys less felicity as a performative utterance than the gay propaganda it bans when viewed from the perspective of those who enacted it. The performative contradiction embedded in the gay propaganda law came fully into view in perhaps the most notorious case of its prosecution to make its way through Russian courts, that of Lena Klimova, founder of Children 404, an online support network for LGBTQ+ adolescents. A journalist in the city of Nizhny Tagil, Klimova created Children 404 shortly before passage of the law to address the dearth of information and support available to young Russians grappling with sexual and gender identity. The organization's pages on social media allow users to tell their story in their own words and images, much like the Trevor and It Gets Better projects here in the United States. After the law's passage, however, Klimova was accused of producing gay propaganda. At first, local courts failed to find her guilty, but when a member of the Young Guard wing of Putin's United Russia Party took up the case in 2015, the courts finally rendered a guilty verdict, fining Klimova 50,000 rubles, which is probably in the range of about $200. In addition, when Children 404's webpage on the Russian social media site Vkontakte was banned, the group simply created another page that garnered more followers than the first. As Klimova's case dragged on, it captured the attention of international media, gaining even more notoriety when a documentary titled Children 404 appeared. Throughout, Klimova continued her activism, authoring 3 books for and about LGBTQ+ youth, and publishing a web project that chronicled the hate speech she had endured. Despite the intentions of those who authored Article 6.21, the attempt to silence Klimova under the law produced more gay propaganda, gave Children 404 greater visibility, and made the journalist into a recognized LGBTQ+ activist. Thanks to its discursive shifts, its vulgarization of queer theory, and the contradictory assumptions that emerged from these two, the gay propaganda law marked a turning point for citizenship as a performative construct during Putin's first 2 decades in the Kremlin. Although the letter of the law prohibits what at first glance looks like a narrow range of discourse, the law's spirit makes multiple demands of all Russian citizens, regardless of gender and sexual orientation. Even those in the country's so-called sexual majority had to prove that they were real Russian men and women by performing a cisgender drag of reproductive heterosexuality that included both hypergender and a vocal, if not violent, homophobia. The higher incidence of hate crimes against LGBTQ+ people since the law's adoption, the anti-gay purges in Chechnya, where gay men have been detained, tortured, and extrajudicially killed since 2017, the dramatic increase in LGBTQ+ immigration from Russia in search of asylum, as well as the victim blaming and self-harassment to which LGBTQ+ Russians subject themselves, all of these attest to the central role homophobia now plays in felicitous performances of Russian citizenship. Those in Russia's sexual minorities face a very difficult choice. Either they too adopt heteronormative drag and live a double life, or, like those who post on Children 404, they become de facto LGBTQ+ activists through their very mere existence as visibly queer Russians. However, anyone who chooses this second option, in effect, volunteers as a scapegoat for the compulsory homophobia of their heteronormative fellow citizens, a situation that became even more dire when the gay propaganda law expanded in 2022 so that information about non-traditional lifestyles or the rejection of family values would be on a legal par with pornography, promoting violence, or encouraging racial, ethnic, or religious enmity. Perhaps the law's greatest performative contradiction is that by turning all visible forms of queer existence into activism, Article 6.21 has done more to foster a coherent and essentialized sexual identity for LGBTQ+ Russians than any other event in the country's history. Now, as I hope my overview of Russia's 2013 gay propaganda law has shown, Putin's gendered and sexualized style of politics has had a profound impact on what it means to be Russian. Article 6.21 has thrown into high relief the performative contradiction intrinsic to all of the policies, laws, and public pronouncements that came out of the Kremlin between 2000 and 2020 with the intent of making Russians more exaggeratedly masculine and feminine, as well as irrefutably straight. For its part, Russian culture propagated and contested this performative contradiction in everything from self-help literature promising to transform frumpy women into bitchy sexpots, to war films glorifying the Soviet Union's disastrous decade in Afghanistan, fictional biopics about Russian First Lady Lyudmila Putina, and even drag queens whose over-the-top glamour puts mere biological women to shame. However, just like the gay propaganda law, whose 2013 version was apparently so ineffectual that it needed overhauling in 2022, none of these gendered performances guaranteed that Russians would heed Putin's heteronormative mandate or that the country would regain its status as a hypermasculine superpower. As the Greek roots that comprise the word homophobia suggest, fear of the queer is ultimately fear of the self. And Putin's heteronormative mandate has made neither Russia's citizens nor their country as a whole any more virile or any straighter. Instead, it's unleashed a tsunami of homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia in the domestic sphere, which has now become Ukrainophobia in the international arena. By now, Putin's special military operation launched in February of 2022 has killed many thousands, displaced millions, and destroyed at least 6 major cities, as well as large swaths of Ukraine's infrastructure. The hypermasculinity that came to define Putin's brand during the 2000s and 2010s has shifted from the symbolic politics of promoting maternity capital and banning gay propaganda to the materiel of war, including the phallic Kinzhal and Iskander missiles bombarding Ukraine. Now, Putin's Ukrainophobia dates back at least to 2008, when he told then US President George W. Bush, Ukraine is not even a state. However, the Russian president's disbelief in Ukraine as a concept doesn't just dismiss the sovereignty of Ukraine, whose language, culture, history, and territory have all been subsumed in Russia's imperial project at multiple points in modern history. Rather, Putin's Ukrainophobia insists that the Ukrainian other is simply another variety of self, making any conflict between Russia and Ukraine into a war between Russia and itself. In other words, Putin's Ukrainophobia repeats the political homophobia articulated in Article 6.21 only writ large, and his invasion of Ukraine represents a tragic yet logical expansion of the waves of fear and hatred that confuse an imaginary Russian self with an equally imaginary other. Like the ideological proxies of heteronormativity and homophobia, the pastiche of Russonormativity and Ukrainophobia driving Putin's war has proven itself powerless to produce a coherent Russian self, Russian idea, Russian world, Russian civilization, or Russian victory. Instead, Putin's diatribes against Western decadence, panegyrics for his country's traditions, and violent insistence that Ukraine is, in fact, Russia, all suffer from the same performative contradiction as Article 6.21. This is nowhere more evident than in Putin's preposterous claim at the start of the war that Russia would occupy Ukraine in a matter of days or weeks. More than 2 years later, it's clear that this was just one more empty performative utterance, and that Putin's phrase-mongering has little impact on his troops' ability to win battles or to occupy Ukrainian ground. Moreover, if the invasion was intended to prevent Ukraine from strengthening its alliances with the European Union and the United States, or to block the expansion of NATO, we can now see that precisely the opposite has happened. At the same time, Russia's own allies have been reduced to Belarus, North Korea, and Iran, while its domestic situation has grown noticeably weaker as thousands leave the country due to economic and social instability, the threat of conscription, political crackdowns, and the heavy toll of international sanctions. At first glance, the war in Ukraine appeared to strengthen Putin's iron grip on his own country and the region. Yet the gulf between what Putin predicted would happen at the war's start and where he actually stands today points to the inherent fragility of his hypermasculine politics. Unlike Putin, pop culture has done fairly well and has been pretty accurate in forecasting how the war in Ukraine would take shape. While the Russian army was losing the battles to take Kiev, Kharkiv, and Kherson, a parallel war emerged in macho memes that compared Putin to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. On the one hand, the Russian media circulated images of Putin that showed Russia's bloated 70-year-old president in the same stuffy Italian suits and Kremlin conference rooms that he's occupied for the past 20 years. On the other hand, Zelensky, who's Putin's junior by a full quarter century, astutely used social media from Instagram to TikTok to broadcast images of himself in more varied clothing and much more daring settings, including full combat gear and the battlefront. This contrast led to a glut of memes that sized up the two presidents' virility and deemed Zelensky the winner. Whether the meme shows two moons rising over an intergalactic horizon, the heaviest object in the universe, a supersized cargo plane as the only transport that can carry them, or the few features on Earth visible from outer space, Zelensky's balls quickly became shorthand for resolute leadership. On the contrary, Putin found himself castigated once again by a condom whose shiny red package reads Putin for dicks that don't know when to pull out. This battle of manly memes uses techniques of political legitimation so widespread that even we in the US recognize them easily. However, the images of women coming out of Ukraine and Russia since the war's start represent something new and unexpected in the highly gendered context of war. Even before Putin's invasion, women comprised about 23% of the Ukrainian military, compared to roughly 4% of Russia's, a statistic that led to a series of photos featuring young, gun-toting female defenders of Ukraine at the start of the war. One popular subgenre of this type of image shows combat-ready Ukrainian women holding cats, dogs, and children, making their amalgam of a masculine activity like war with a feminine attribute like nurturing all the more obvious. Other images in this vein include former Miss Ukraine Anastasia Lena posing with an airsoft rifle, Ukrainian mothers carrying guns, grandmothers making Molotov cocktails, and of course, The gutsy woman who cursed a Russian occupier, telling him to put sunflower seeds in his pocket so they would grow on Ukrainian soil when he dies. These Ukrainian women clearly refuse the limited terms of the hypergender that characterizes Putin's vision of Russianness. Instead, they're bravely changing the Venn diagram of Ukrainian gender so that masculinity and femininity now overlap, allowing men and women to share the same life-giving attributes and activities, occupy the battlefield side by side, and shoulder the burden of averting the existential threat to their country together. Women in Russia have also done what they can to bring Putin's march through Ukraine to a halt. After the imposition of stronger censorship, an editor at the state-controlled television Channel 1 interrupted a live news broadcast while carrying a clearly visible placard whose words included "No war, stop the war, don't believe the propaganda, they're lying to you here." Likewise, a group of Russian women formed the Feminist Anti-War Resistance Alliance, whose manifesto denounces traditional values, including gender inequality, exploitation of women, state repression against those whose way of life, self-identification, and actions don't conform with narrow patriarchal norms. In addition to organizing a protest shortly after the conflict's start, the group maintains a presence on Telegram so that they can share images from their protests as well as guidelines and support for those hoping to combat the war. Like their Ukrainian counterparts fighting Russian troops, these women are Putin's worst nightmare, since they completely defy the heteronormative mandate that's been his calling card for more than 2 decades. It's still too early for us to speculate who or what the ideal Russian citizen will become once the monstrous war in Ukraine comes to an end. However, we can state with confidence that this ideal will not include young air cadets twerking in their dorms, LGBTQ Russians who dare to live openly queer lives, or Russian women who refuse Putin's heteronormative mandate. Nor will it include the millions of Ukrainians willing to die so that their country does not become a drag version of Russia. Perhaps Putin's new dream of his country's ideal citizen lies in the more than 85,000 Russian troops who, according to some estimates, have already perished on the battlefields of Mariupol, Lviv, and other Ukrainian cities. Like the millions of Soviet soldiers who gave their lives in World War II and Afghanistan, the dead can no longer tell their own story, making them fodder for the type of myth-making on which Putin relies as Russia's leader. Admittedly, this closing conjecture is pretty bleak, but I hope it allows us to recognize that the playful performative contradiction embedded in the Ulyanovsk cadets' viral celebrity was always dead serious, and that it always had and always will have lethal stakes. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Yeah. Julie, thank you very much for a really stimulating talk. This is fascinating. I've got many, many questions for you, but I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. I'm holding this microphone because we are videoing this presentation so that people who couldn't be here can enjoy it later. So if you do have a question, I'd like you just to take the microphone and speak your question into the microphone so that it can be part of the recording, if that's okay. So at the risk of seeming like Phil Donahue, and only about 4 people in the room will understand that reference. So any questions, please?
Or just comments.
Or comments. Yeah, Nina.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for really, really compelling talk. Well, Putin, of course, it's really ironic that the Hamas attack occurred on October 7th, which was Putin's birthday, right? So he's about to turn 72. And my understanding is that by this time, the macho image, the hyper-masculine image, has not been pushed of late. And I think I remember in 2017, there was an interview with Oliver Stone where he first revealed that he has grandchildren. And then he's been went to some camp for gifted children, a little bit now like Lenin with the children and Stalin with the children, and a more avuncular image. So I wonder if you could address that.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, I told you guys a lot of stuff. I didn't have time to go into the periodization of the, you know, so-called cult of Putin. And definitely, he's been in power long enough that his handlers, the so-called political technologists in the Kremlin, have developed a series of different strategies to address the fact that he's an aging man. And as I see it, the initial period, he first comes to power in 1999, and up through about 2011, 2012, when there's a series of widespread protests in Russia, this is the period where we see the topless photographs of him on vacation, or photographs of him piloting a fighter jet and what have you. This is the period in which Putin's really being sold as a black belt in judo, as hyper-masculine in that kind of muscled way, but simultaneously as a family man. Okay, this is important because it's quite a departure from what you would see in earlier versions of Russian masculinity. With the so-called Snow Revolution, these protests that took place with tens of thousands of people in major Russian cities, it was clear that wasn't enough. And so in addition to having a lot of policy and legislation that begins the, rather extensive process of clamping down on free speech, they are retailoring Putin's image at the same time. And in 2013, he and his wife are coming out of a performance in the Kremlin of Esmeralda, the ballet, I believe, and they announced their mutual agreement that they will have a divorce. And the publicity around Putin focuses on his young mistresses who are having children at Swiss VIP clinics. So he loses the middle-aged wife and upgrades to someone younger, and there's still an attempt to show him in the gym being virile, but it's clear that they have to sort of invest more, how shall we say, higher octane gas in that model. And as I see it, the third period is the one where he is an old man, and certainly by Russian standards, 70, 72 is quite old, and there are still a couple of rumors about mistresses who he's dating, but it has to do with this, outward manifestation of war, and also him refiguring a lot of women as these sort of matushki, these kind of sacred, revered women who are very religious. So there's really distinct periods that we can look at, and we can recognize how the changes are triggered not only by Putin aging, but also by the relative effectiveness or ineffectiveness of everything that came before. So that's a kind of short answer to a very good question.
Don't fear the mic. Any questions or comments? Okay, seeing none. I've got many, but one of the things I wanted to ask you, Julie, was this sort of inadvertent or this post-2013 rise in cisgender drag that leads to these sort of exaggeratedly traditional gender roles where you've got hypermasculinity on the one hand and you got hyperfemininity on the other hand, and presumably one would think that this would result in these hypermasculine men and these hyperfeminine women having lots of good old-fashioned heterosexual sex, and that the birth rate would increase, right? I mean, wouldn't that be a kind of natural and desirable, from the point of view of somebody like Putin, result of such a trend? But my sense is that that hasn't happened. So the birth rate, if you could sort of talk about what's been going on. You talked about the life expectancies, but what about the birth rate?
Well, the short story is, and from what I've read, I'm not an economist, but the economists seem to have figured out that in most countries that birth rates, the rise and fall of birth rate has to do with things like industrialization and basically rise of the middle class, access to the means to actually raise children. So interestingly enough, some of the crisis in birth rate in the late 2000s, it began to diminish and Russians began having more children, but that seems to be more a product of the oil and gas boom of the 2000s, which brought a lot of money and quite a bit of affluence into Russian society, than any of this stuff. And certainly you can go out and you can find the sort of Russian version of trad wives who have their TikToks and this, that, and the other. They're wearing their headscarves and they have 10 children and they'll tell you how to ferment pickles and stuff like that. There are things like this going on, but you know, from what I understand, it is very, very difficult to come up with any correlation between these kind of, you know, sort of symbolic political strategies and birth rate. That the economic ones, that's where the rubber hits the road when it comes to whether people have babies or not.
I was just thinking, it's not a question, but I was wondering if I can add some comments on the birth rate and the situation in current Russia, because I came back just 2 months ago.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know if you know, but they are preparing a new law that is going to be passed in like November, they say, against the child-free. They say child-free movement.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I just had a piece of news sent to me by a friend that apparently the propaganda of child-free that is going to be banned includes even a conversation between a husband and a wife if they discuss, let's say, in public space,
God.
not being ready to have kids. If a woman says about like, what is it, like postnatal depression in a social media, all of that is going to be banned.
Prosecutable.
Yes.
Wow. Well, you know, you can tell I'm really focusing on the period up to 2020, and very sadly, you're right. There has been these laws have, and you know, being child-free. This is one that I'm like, how can you legislate that? Many people are child-free for very good reasons, or not because they want to be. But this also reminds me, important to add, you know, in addition to ramping up that gay propaganda law in 2022, about a year ago in November, and some of you might have read about this, that basically the international LGBTQ+ movement was labeled extremist. And that means that, you know, once again, it's a performative contradiction. We didn't know there was an international LGBTQ+ movement, but apparently there is one now. And people have been prosecuted under this and put in jail. People who just have, you know, bar owners who work in gay bars as being extremists. Yeah. No, it has to be said, the legislation that's coming out in the area of the family, reproduction, gender, and sexuality is quite shocking. It's quite shocking and quite upsetting. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm just curious, did Putin use his ex-wife in any of the propaganda? Like, if he's the hypermasculine version, was she subjected to hyperfemininity in any of the propaganda?
Well, you know, that's a really good question, and it's a kind of, I'll give you a sort of yes/no answer, because on the one hand, Russia doesn't have the institution of the First Lady as we do. And American First Ladies, or, you know, let's see if we get a First Gentleman, usually they engage in not so much governmental, but social, philanthropic work associated with the family, childhood, and things like this. And that does not happen in Russia. So Lyudmila Putina, the actual real wife of Vladimir Putin up until 2013, never did that kind of thing. However, her image was groomed and manufactured in a couple of different ways to have her be the archetypal Slavic woman. Okay, blonde hair, blue eyes. She had 2 children, you know, whereas the goal is 3 or more because they want population growth in Russia. I know a book that Professor Tumarkin is assigning called First Person. It's a sort of series of interviews with Vladimir Putin and Lyudmila Putina. She's very careful to describe her disinterest in politics. She's much more interested in fashion, designers, and whatnot, but not in politics. And as I see that, that is a part of this ideal feminine citizen in the 2000s. You should be someone who's more interested in your gel nails and your hair dye than you are in politics. It's, you know, you should be all happy and excited that Vladimir Putin is a handsome man and he's sober and all this stuff, but you should not be engaging actively in politics. So yes, she was used strategically, but in a way that is very, very different from what we would expect if we know anything about the institution of the First Lady in the United States. Good question. Oh, over there. Oh, please.
Hi, so you mentioned trad wives earlier, and I feel like lately also in the United States there's been a lot of growth in sort of hyper masculinity and hyper femininity, especially online. And I was wondering if you noticed any connections between what's happening over here online and what's happening in Russia.
There is absolutely no doubt about that connection. And it's not just that I've noticed it, but there are several people who've done some really interesting research on the kind of genetic links between neoconservatism and traditional family values in the United States and in the Russian Federation. And there are a couple of key thinkers whose names I can't remember and prefer not to mention right now, let's put it that way, who were involved in basically planting some seeds of ideas, there were a couple of conferences in which these two communities kind of overlapped and intersected. And while in Russia it takes on a distinctly Russian Orthodox flavor, basically, yeah, everybody's on TikTok, everybody's looking at the same videos now, so yes, absolutely.
Sorry. I don't really have like a formulated question, but this is sort
That's
of
okay.
just, I don't know, maybe something you can comment on. How this, like, in Russia, this like ideal, like hyper masculine man character, as they want Putin to demonstrate or exemplify, how that has kind of influenced, like, here in the US, the like right-wing extremists' ideal character for a president, so like Trump, for example. I don't think Trump is their idea, because like I just remember this one, like I think it was probably Fox News clip comparing Biden and Putin and saying like Putin's like riding a horse and he has no helmet and he's shirtless, whereas President Biden's just over here cycling, helmet clad, all this weird comparison stuff, and I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, you know, I don't have anything, you know, super incisive to say other than the fact that there are American fans of Vladimir Putin. And the last time I really checked in with this was, I think, it was the last presidential election. And there were a series of, you know, articles in the media, and there were people who were posting about how Putin was offering a much better model for presidential power. And yeah, you know, I would have to say one thing we have to keep in mind. I mean, there are a lot of tensions in American politics, but at this point in time, no one's legislating that you have to like or not like Putin. And the kind of laws that we're talking about in Russia are clamping down on freedom of speech and basically making it very dangerous, making people very vulnerable, you know, in their lives if they do not exhibit these things. You can believe that Vladimir Putin is great in the US or believe that he is not. And, you know, we're always going to have some people, I think, who are huge fans of that particular style of masculinity, despite the fact that for all of the strength that it exhibits, it is actually very, very fragile. The most fragile form of gender is one that doesn't allow itself any contact whatsoever with any other kind of gender, because the slightest whiff of femininity will bring your masculinity crumbling down, which is why your question about how are we dealing with Vladimir Putin aging is so important. So that's kind of a response, but yeah, that's one that, how shall I say, I have a hard time going and reading about American fans of Putin. So I only dip into that occasionally, but thanks.
Hi, once again, thank you so much for speaking
Thank
today.
you.
I just had a question that if Kamala were to be elected, how would the dynamics of her being a woman sort of affect relations between the United States and Russia?
Oh, that is such a good question. And I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure. I am not sure what will happen. This is something that, you know, the kind of charisma that Putin sports is one that doesn't admit that women can have charisma at all. And Harris is proving that she has some, and she might actually go someplace very interesting with it. So I'm not a political scientist, and if there's one thing I don't have, it's a crystal ball. But I can't imagine relationships right now between the United States and the Kremlin are pretty bad. And I don't think that having a woman of color as our president would improve them in any way whatsoever. And if anything, I would hope Harris, you know, when she becomes president, would perhaps draw some brighter lines in the sand with Russia. I would want that, but that's just my wish. Sure, yeah, maybe one or two more questions.
Very early on, when you talked about the response to the video in Ulyanovsk, and citizens of Ulyanovsk, you know, they said they were appalled, and that it was an insult to veterans.
Yes.
Could you talk about why specifically to veterans?
Well, let's be clear about this. It wasn't so much citizens of Ulyanovsk, it was officials, state officials in Ulyanovsk, and particularly in that Institute of Aeronautical Engineering. They were kind of called to task, and there was this, you know, this huge kind of, in the media, in the state-sponsored media, this sort of outrage that young men could do this. I mean, come on, we've all done worse things in our dorms, haven't we? I mean, that was just some good fun, if you ask me. Some guys having a good time with their iPhones. So, so the insult to veterans, I think, is because this aeronautical, this Institute of Aeronautical Engineering has generated many people who've served in the military. And so the idea of the contiguity that these are young men who are being groomed so that they can serve in the military, and they in turn will become veterans. So the idea of, you know, veterans as a kind of privileged state of masculinity for pretty much all Russian men given compulsory conscription.
Oh, I had a question about like the 2013 law banning gay propaganda. You mentioned that like the idea of sexuality was kind of posited in a way where it can be kind of influenced by such like so-called gay propaganda. So I was wondering, like, why is there this conception of sexuality being something that kind of can be changed in a way? Because I feel like a lot of times when it comes to very like heteronormative societies, it's just sort of put forth as like, oh, everyone is just heterosexual and there's no other narrative. So why is it a little bit different, it seems, in this case?
You know, that's interesting. Why is it incoherent? You know, I don't have a good answer for that, other than it's as if this particular strategy for trying to manipulate people into being straight, into having more babies, sort of caught people in this inconsistency, that legislating this kind of censorship law, as I, you know, argued using, you know, stuff from Judith Butler, is going to be inherently contradictory. And these people didn't think about it when they were writing up this law and when they were testing it out in the provinces. And they, I think, didn't care about that incoherence. They kind of really didn't give a you-know-what, because their goal was to just get everyone to be as straight as possible. You know, I suppose I'm having difficulty coming up with a more satisfying answer, because I think it would have required a different kind of thought on the part of the people making this law to actually, you know, to make something that didn't have such an inconsistency. Does that make sense? Okay.
Hi, I was wondering, since especially with a big part of the hope of the masculine and feminine ideals is to kind of boost the population, if you know, or if you know any specific laws maybe about how the kind of image of children or childcare has changed?
Oh, wow. Well, more than anything, I know the vast majority of these laws that ended up becoming increasingly harsh harsh censorship in the 2010s to today, the thin end of the wedge was protecting children always. Why shut down on the internet? Because we need to protect children. Why get rid of this? Because children might see this type of image and we consider it pornography. So children were used as the reason basically to start clamping down on free speech and shutting down on a lot of things that seemed like they were way too dangerous and way too wild. So I'm trying to think about, I'd have to, I can point you to some people who do research in this area that you could probably get more things about, specifically childcare. Yeah, but I would, from what I know about it, it's just as incoherent as other things. On the one hand, children, they claim that they're protecting children in one way. In other ways, they're left incredibly vulnerable, so, yeah.
Maybe one more?
If there is one more.
I have one more. It's a specialty question, and maybe it's going to put you on the spot a little bit because I've been reading your book and loving every bit of it. And this is for the sake of many of the students in this room who are in my survey of 19th century Russian literature, where we've started reading Nikolai Gogol today. And one of the concepts that they're going to become very familiar with starting on Friday is the concept of poshlost.
Yes.
And you in your book have a very interesting section where you talk about poshlost, styoba, and glamour. And I was just wondering, and here I am putting you on the spot, can you just, for the purposes, just offer a brief description for the purposes of summary as we wrap up, what is poshlost and why is it important to your argument? Because I think the students who are going to be hearing about Nabokov's conception of it are going to get a nice contrast from the way you use it.
Okay. Well, I'll try to make this a short answer. So, perhaps what's important, first off, is to say, and I didn't tell you how I define style in this talk, but basically I define style in this book as the way that we construct ourselves by appropriating others and otherness. Okay, so I'm wearing this because I saw cool people wearing jumpsuits, and so I wear jumpsuits, right? I'm doing something that other people do, and that helps me to define who I am. And poshlost is a style that typically those who've written about have said, this is a word that is so uniquely Russian, it cannot be translated, no one can understand it. And Nabokov did a great job, posh-lust, okay? Poshlost, it actually comes from a past tense of a motion verb in Russian. Those of you who know Russian, poshlo, poshlost. So it used to refer to something that was old and antiquated and out of style, but now the best equivalent probably in English is tacky. Something that's tacky or tasteless. However, in Russian, this word has a sort of affinity for femininity, for sort of tacky, tasteless women. So, and the example I use in my book is a particular character from Chekhov. Have any of you read Lady with a Lapdog? Dama Sabachke? Okay, the lady with the lapdog, she has an adulterous affair. And in the very moment after she's broken her wedding vow, she sits there and sort of says, oh my God, I'm a fallen woman. I'm so bad. I'm so poshlaya. I'm so tacky. Okay, so it's this kind of a feeling that something is tacky, and people have compared it in English to camp, but it's not really that. Because camp is, well, let's be honest, it's about drag queens, right? Okay? And poshlost isn't. Poshlost is something anyone can have. And I also, in the book, I talk about how very typical of poshlost today, there are myriad tests out on the internet where young women can test how tacky, how poshlaya are you. And usually it has to do with how many different sexual positions you can occupy, okay? And sort of like, the nasty associations, and off-color jokes and things like this. So, yeah. Is that good enough? Because, okay. Well, I want to thank all of you. You were very kind and patient to listen to everything I had to say and to ask such cool and intelligent questions, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.